So, the first LO1 slide that I put together, what I'm going to do is go through some of the key bits which relate to, the learning outcome one. But the idea would be to try and discuss it from a point of view of healthcare and, the NHS as a background when we look at the role of risk assessment specifically within the health and social care sector. So I've started off with some very basics in terms of, understanding what is risk, definition of risk, how risk is identified, and then slowly and gradually we've delved into, looking at how this is looked at from a policy level point of view within the NHS. So ask me questions, and obviously if you have any queries, do ask me on that, and we will discuss with regards to the unit. So this particular unit, is quite important. Let's put it this way in the healthcare sector, because if risks are identified, then that definitely at some stage relates to there is a slippage either in the service standards or the quality deteriorating, and that's the reason that we see that when we look at professionals working within this sector, when we look at charities, NGOs, we look at any ancillary organizations which support the National Health Service or contractors, suppliers, partners, there is a keen sense of managing risk, and the I'll put it this way, when I say management comes later, there's a key to determining the risk as what kind of standards, if risk is, what kind of standards could slip, and when standards slip, what we get to see is that at some stage it affects the quality of service which the National Health Service and some of the organizations in the health and social care sector actually deliver. So when we look at patient care, there's a lot of risk assessment which happens on that. When we look at, people receiving medical care, clinical care, or, post-clinical care with supported ancillary organizations of the NHS, you sometimes see that if proper risk assessment is not done, that means proper checking of the standards is not done, then sometimes the quality of service which is going to be delivered to somebody who's entitled to receiving it or is receiving it after an operation, a procedure, or an illness, then we see that these lead to compromises, and in some cases it's that serious that it leads to death. So there are a lot of commissions and inquiries when EQC looks in sets and the undertakes from time to time, and this is what we see wherein standards slip, quality slips, services, quality of services slip, and that goes to and points the finger at that proper risk assessments weren't done. So I think in the news, if you have looked at in the last couple of weeks, there was a PCT trust in particular in the Liverpool area in Merseyside, which has now been opened up for investigation because it had a lot of deaths with regards to patients over a 15-year period, and obviously there's a serious investigation and a criminal investigation which is now opened up because relatives of people who lost near dear ones have campaigned quite a lot, and what they said was there were lots of risks taken. There were no I'll use the word, there was no semblance to adhering to the standards, and at times standards were flouted, and that's why these deaths, and over a period of time they've happened. So risk and risk identification in the area of health and social care is very, very important. So let's look at some of the slides with that background. Now, how do you define risk? I would put it this way: when you look at defining risk, what we look at is what are the potential circumstances or potential situations in which something could go wrong. So when you drive, for example, give you a classical example. When you drive, you are always looking at the mirror MSM routine, mirror signal routine. And the reason why you look at that routine is because you're trying to minimize, the risk of somebody either bumping into you or you bumping into somebody. So you maintain distance while you're driving, and you look at, that particular routine which we go through when we are actually giving a driving test, or, we are doing a practical test to achieve our license. So when we look at things which have the potential of going, haywire, going wrong, potentially something happening, a breakdown happening. If you're traveling long distance and you're driving down, a couple of things that we still do in order to look at minimizing the car breaking down is things like looking at the the wash wiper liquid, we look at the oil, look at fuel, look at tire pressure. And these are things why you're doing is because you want to kind of mitigate, minimize the whole concept of, having to face a risk that if the car is to break down, then it will lead to serious delays in journeys and obviously other problems and issues on the way. So you want to make a good family trip, you look at these issues and you try and kind of, preempt them to see if these are problems which could happen. And you basically go through a checklist to say that, okay, these are risks which could occur, or these are things which actually pose a certain amount of uncertainty. And that is where something when you don't know the outcome of is generally classified as something called risk. Now, risk is always a probability. So some definitions of risk, base it on that, okay, something is to go wrong. It can go wrong. There's a 50% probability in some cases. But, sometimes you try and mitigate and reduce these because you're looking at going through a checklist or a series of lists to ensure, or, some sort of checkpoints to ensure that, you don't face these problems or issues. Is that okay?
Yes, that's
now when we look
at a few classic ones on those.
So when you look at, if we look at adding the word management, obviously this is a word which is overused, abused. When we look at studying the course, every time this word comes across, it means one or more, sometimes it means the same thing, which is how do you manage, or what kind of strategies or what kind of things that you employ or you bring about to try and manage a particular situation. So risk management, will encompass essentially, a role of trying to see that where all you could face problems or issues, how can these problems and issues be identified? What is the severity of this problem that it could, affect, say, for example, sticking to that classic example of driving, if you're going on a long drive, if you have a flat tire, what that could eventually cost in terms of, consequence, in terms of time, effort, and obviously a call out, delay, so we look at measuring, the severity of what this issue could bring in terms of, problems, issues, and then to a certain extent, when we look at managing this in a professional setting, we have to relate it to time and cost. So time, cost, quality, the triangle that we talk about, in terms of time, cost, and quality, we look at that is because if one thing gets affected, the other two things get compromised. So when we look at that, it has financial implications from an organizational standpoint of view. And here you will recall, and I would say that when you look at organizations, when you work in a business or in a setup which is running, and providing services, you will see generally all employees have something called a public liability insurance. They have an employer liability insurance. And the reason why they have this is you have an insurance while you're driving. You're confident that I'm a good driver, but you still have an insurance on a car or, on certain things, is because of the fact that you cannot anticipate, what is going to happen. So when we look at that sense of anticipation, and because of which what we do is we go in and buy an insurance policy. So here, when we look at the concept of management, what we are looking at is from start to finish, anything that we encounter from a point of view of identifying where problem or issues can occur, to taking it to some monetary related aspects. So it could be income, it could be property, it could be, causing a damage in some cases. And what we want to be able to do is secure or safeguard the business in the premises and the individuals that work within that by taking out an insurance. So the whole process of managing, reducing, eliminating, or I would say, mitigating risk would primarily be the process of something called risk management. Is that okay?
Yes.
Now, so now going forward, let's relate the concept of risk and risk management to healthcare in particular, because we are studying this unit in the context of healthcare. So when we look at risk management, we look at where all do you look at risks or minimizing risks?
So are you... Where they are, they're all over the place. Most of my risks, you can imagine, I work and visit people in their own homes, so I have a huge amount of risk assessing and a risk management to do all the time. Just walking up to somebody's front door can be risky. That's not to mention the fact that I've driven there in the first place. Yeah. But you have to manage those risks against the probability of them happening.
That's correct. So it could be security. It could be things like, when you look at when you're going to meet somebody and obviously provide care. So it will be looking at proper risk assessment in terms of ensuring that, is there a lift? Is the place safe? And you mentioned if you're driving down, then you look at the whole aspect of, how long is it going to take? What are the contingencies that you have to put in place if the car is to break down or you get stuck in traffic? Then you make a phone call. So all those things are essentially related to, the assessment of risk. Now, the whole purpose of, if we relate this, what we've spoken about is to where all do we encounter this in healthcare? We look at things like risk to patients. When we look at vulnerability to staff, because sometimes when you are going into a home to primarily provide care or visit the person to find out if they are okay, not okay, and things like that, it could be a risk potentially to the staff in terms of, especially when we look at women and females. We also look at sometimes risks which can be posed because it becomes a risk at the organizational level. So here, if somebody is to sue an organization because something has gone wrong, then they don't end up suing the person, but they end up suing the organization, and that is why some of that risk could be organizational. So NHS, if you see, and what we get to read from time to time, and there was an article about 2 years back wherein it said, wherein a study actually brought out that lawyers or they were called the hungry sharks. Essentially, the headline on the front pages of most newspapers said hungry sharks cost 480 million pounds a year to the NHS, which is basically cost of litigations and cases which people bring out using expert lawyers, which are able to get them more compensation for a surgery went wrong or a procedure which has gone wrong. So there are lots of different types of risks. I think each of that risk cannot be compared in terms of saying this is more severe or that is less severe, but there are different types, and obviously they can be identified on 3 different fronts: patient, staff, and organization. Now, sometimes you will see if the setup is quite big, there is a particular person in the organization which is designated as a risk manager, and that person is basically tasked with the main responsibility of assessing, developing, and implementing and monitoring the risk management plan. So, for example, when you look at most organizations, you have a health and safety, person, somebody who's a first aider, somebody who's a fire marshal, and these kind of things. When organizations help train or ask individuals to do training, nominate a person, the idea is that person becomes the custodian of basically looking at managing some part of that risk which is related to, say, first aid or health and safety. So similarly, in larger organizations, there could be different types of risks which we will get into. But here, when we talk about the NHS, we talk about large organizations wherein you will generally see they provide a lot of services. You will see that the organizations like NGOs in particular, anything which is to do with mental health care, you look at, healthcare professionals in particular, and we look at nursing homes, care homes, old age homes, we look at the NHS. All such places, if they have large enough operations, you will see there are 1 or 2 health care, or within the healthcare, there are risk managers who look after these assessments, the plans, the monitoring, and the implementation of those standards so that risks are minimized in these organizations. Now, the priority, obviously, from an NHS point of view, is to minimize risk in terms of delivering the best possible patient care. And when we look at that, they look at other I would say smaller risks which could compromise patient care which has been given, and that could be finances. So we time and again hear that the NHS is cash strapped, there is not enough finances, and that is where the practice managers, the trusts are having to cut or curtail services. So finance to a certain extent becomes one of the parameters through which it can lead to increased risks to patients. Or, in some cases, obviously, as I mentioned, the example of the Liverpool Trust, which is now closed, in terms of even deaths. Safety, it could be, we'll talk about different types of risk. So finance, safety, and, patient, primary reason of looking at reducing risks being patient care in this sector. And when we look at that, we look at a lot of different services which can contribute and alleviate these risks if they are not looked into by the risk managers.
Yes, now, and in social care, where we've got such huge amount of funding cuts. It's all about managing the risk to make sure that we give the minimum that we have to without costing too much money. It's all about what's the risk if we don't do that, what's the risk, what could happen, what's the worst case scenario. So we're constantly managing the risk of not putting in a service against putting in a service cost now. It's turned around badly.
Absolutely. So what you said is correct. You're looking at prioritizing with reduced budgets and, funds available. You're trying to prioritize which services would be more, required in order to look at, in some cases, you're also dealing with a lot of risks. And because one is larger than the other or bigger than the other, what you're looking at doing is, okay, we need to divert funds to this so that this does not slip. That risk could be minimized or, could be handled if something is to happen. So because of the scarcity of funds, that is one of the things which, help the risk managers in health and social care are having to manage. Now, there are lots of risks that we were talking about. So risks can arise because of finances. It can arise because of insurance, because of claims being made. Sometimes you will see risks can also be typically within this area of health and social care. In the case of, when you look at medical side or clinical side of things within the NHS, it could also relate to, the post-care which is given when somebody undergoes some sort of an operation or surgery. And sometimes these risks, when we look at, say, fire drills which happen within offices, when we look at fire drills which happen at the airport, we look at firefighters conducting drills, they are basically done in order to minimize risks because the premises in which maybe a fire breaking out or, some sort of an emergency happening is quite high. So sometimes in order to look at minimizing those risks, there are these compulsory drills or, I would say, compulsory drills which have to be done in order to ensure that everybody is prepared if such an eventuality is to happen, and they are in the best possible position to be able to, in an event of something happening, best possible position to be able to, manage that risk. Now, having understood some broad criteria about what is risk, what is risk management, why do we need to look at risk management within health and social care, and then just briefly skimming the surface to understand what are the main responsibilities of somebody who works as a risk, somebody who works within the health and social care sector and is responsible for risk management or minimizing of risks using the concept of risk management. And then we look at what are the different types of risks which we essentially look at, and they could be in the area of patient care, and then the subsidiary types of risks which can kind of increase that risk to patient care would be things like finances, scarcity of funds, what we discussed, and in terms of infrastructure, is sometimes trained manpower, if it's not available, then can also pose a risk. So there are different types, and what we want to be able to do now is expand what we've understood into the first assessment criteria to look at how do you examine the role of risk management as a function within a business. Now, when we look at NHS, it is a big machinery, it is a big setup, it is a big organization, but when you look at NHS England in particular, or look at, say, NHS Scotland in particular, or look at a small organization, whichever you want to take as an example, what we want to be able to do is understand how this function actually works within that setup. So we go through basic things like, sometimes you will see when we spoke about the example of, the health and safety, a person who's a first aider within the organization. And if you think of that process, what we think of is most organizations will have a first aid box. Within that first aid box, they have what is called the incident logbook. So why the book is there and, why they have some sort of, first aid box available is because if something is to happen, then the incident needs to be logged. And obviously there is, help at hand to be able to provide first aid at the first instance. So similarly, when we talk about this in a bit of wider purview, and we look at it from an organizational standpoint of view, we look at risk, we look at a risk register, and then what we do is we manage those risks. So most organizations take out liability insurances because when you see, minimum threshold being 5 million, in some cases when we look at large organizations tendering for some projects within the NHS or some projects being outsourced from the NHS, their insurance liability increases and they do a higher risk insurance. So that could be anywhere from 10 million to 150 million, because when you look at large pharma companies, when they supply drugs or become a preferred supplier to NHS, in some cases you will see that the insurance liability or the premium that they pay increases drastically. Now, some of the other bits that we want to understand is how do we look at the whole process of risk identification. Now, the basic 7 what, why, where, when, how that we ask as questions, in terms of how do we identify risk, why do we need to identify risk, where is the risk, and how can this risk affect the operations of a business or an organization, and what can we learn if there is a risk, what can we learn from that particular situation to be able to minimize that in the reoccurrence of that in the future. So when we look at all that, what we are trying to look at is basically understand the process of something called risk identification. Now, where all do you think in the health and social care sector, in the NHS in general, you will see that there are possibilities of facing risk? There are possibilities of risk all around. I might take the next step. You're walking down the road. You take a couple of steps, and you have your feet wobbles, and you have a sprained ankle. You slip, because the pavement is not made properly, and you've had a slip trip fall. That is a risk. But when you look at from an organizational perspective, some of the points that I can think of, which I put on this slide, is where all do you think risks can occur? If you're providing direct services, if you're managing operations, or there are a set of operations which are being run by an organization wherein these services are being provided. You could also have risks when you look at employing contractual manpower, which could be related to obviously contractors in particular, and the human resources risk. You look at financial risks. Sometimes when you make investment in business, or if testing of a particular drug is being done, or a particular equipment is being done, there are some financial risks that it might not work out the way, or the outcome of that will not work out. The pilot might not work out in terms of providing the results which actually are required. So in some cases, when you look at when you look at the healthcare setting in general, we can classify areas in which we can actually have risks, and these are some of the areas. So when you look at, I think in the early 80s, 90s, when a lot of buildings underwent refurbishment because of the accumulation of use of asbestos in particular, that meant that the buildings were unsafe for work, and in those cases you had risks primarily because of the building, the estate, the equipment which was being used, and that led to risk in general, for workers who were working in those places or in those buildings. But then you also look at risks which could arise because of technology. So you have a PC wherein you could have a incident wherein it could be hacking, for example, a virus attack, that kind of a risk. So in those cases, even technological risks can occur within this sector. And I think, again, going back to what I recall in the news, I'm not too sure, but a couple of years back, some of the IT computer system in the NHS, was a target of hackers, and a lot of operations procedures had to be cancelled in the NHS, in NHS England in particular. And that meant that, that was a security threat or a risk which posed because hackers had hacked into the NHS IT system. And that's where, the operations and procedures which were planned for a number of, I would say, days or weeks were actually cancelled because they wanted to make sure that this does not pose further risk to the when the operations and procedures are happening. Now, once you've identified risks, what we then look at is how do we. If you identify risks, I think I mentioned this earlier. What type of risks you kind of categorize them into? What kind of categorization would you have? There are different types, but when we look at this sector in general, you have 3 types which are broadly identified. One is safety risk, second is reputational, and the third is risk related to resources. So we look at, I put some slides together just with 1 or 2 bullet points to say what are safety risks. So safety risks could be risks that could lead to death, disability, or severe distress to patients or staff. when you look at reputational risks, these could lead to some sort of litigation, as I mentioned earlier. This could be in the form of a simple thing, which is like a formal complaint. You're not happy with the services that your GP is providing in your surgery. You put in a bit of a complaint in the, or some sort of a written note in a suggestions box at the surgery. But that, if it's not looked into, you raise that risk, you raise that complaint again, and it starts to pose then a reputational risk, to a GP or a doctor or a particular set of things that you've looked at. It could be the surgery. Now, on a larger scale, these could be risks which could pose a serious threat to the reputation. And in this case, when we look at other organizations like CQC in particular, they do a lot of inspections, visits, and what they want to do is when they make these visits, they're checking on the standards in particular, they are checking on the service levels in particular, and they are trying to gauge areas wherein risks are posing, the slippage of services is actually posing a threat, to patient care. And that is where they put these, sanctions in place or restrictions on the allocation of budget, and, a review then starts. And this is because the PCG trust, or maybe a large setup within the NHS, is not meeting the required set objectives in terms of, it could be any objectives, but they're not meeting those objectives, the targets, and that is leading to, losses, delays, and obviously loss of reputation. Now, when we talk about resources and we talk about risks related to resources, you're looking at, risks which could lead to a financial loss. It could lead to contract being lost. It could lead to also, equipment and building being lost. So, for example, if something is to happen, we look at this particular problem of MRSA, which is the bug, which has become a potent problem in some of the NHS hospitals, in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So this has no, antibiotic or any sort of, cure for it as of now. And the only way in some cases wherein this has become a serious epidemic, what they have to do is some sections of, let's put it this way, not the whole hospital, but some sections or areas of the hospital are totally disinfected, demolished, and, obviously they have to be reconstructed because this poses a serious threat. And when I say serious threat, that means it has led to a lot of deaths in the past with patients having received post-clinical care after an operation procedure, but have had that bug, or have got affected by that, and that is a serious threat wherein they have to sometimes take a decision to look at even replacing equipment and the buildings. Now, when we look at where all do these risks, what are the agencies involved in the identification of these risks? So some of them come across from the statutory bodies which are working within this sector. It could be the Royal Colleges, it could be the NCPOD, which was National Confidential Inquiry Service. We have various NHS trust reports. So NHSE is the National Health Service in England reports. You look at some of the other reports which some of the bodies bring out, and these reports basically look at identifying continuously the areas of risks, which could be both internal and could be external. So any questions on this so far? Okay. So when we look at, okay. So questions on this so far, Christina?
No, I have no questions so far. Thank you. I'm fine.
Okay. Identification leading to assessment. So now that we know that the risks are there, what we want to be able to do is assess those risks, and put together a small table which basically talks about the different types of assessment of risk which can happen. So when we look at a risk register in a particular organization, there are these internal and external risks, and they can be further classified, into different types. And here the assessment of the risk is done using a particular format. And when you assess those risks, you end up classifying them into what kind of risks they are. So either they are risks to the reputation, safety, resources, and then accordingly some sort of action is put forward for implementation. So I'll go into an action. So we've identified We've assessed the risks using some sort of a template risk assessment policy, which is there in different organizations, and that could be very specific to an organization. And when we look at that, what we're looking at now is that we know they have been identified, we know what kind of problems or issues say whether it's financial, reputational, safety related, what they can cause. Then we have to develop some sort of a plan to mitigate or reduce those risks. And in most cases, we follow, a reduction, avoidance, transfer, acceptance kind of a approach. And this is a theoretical approach which has been developed, wherein, sometimes you have to reduce the risks by taking action. Sometimes you have to avoid the risks by doing some particular action. Sometimes you have to transfer the risk to, and that is under the transference. And I'll give you an example. And sometimes you have to accept the risks because you accept a smaller risk in order to mitigate or minimize a larger risk, because that allows you to learn from experience, and in some cases that allows some sort of a contingency plan to be developed. So reduction, avoidance, transfer, and acceptance. Now these kind of things, this 4-step action plan we also take in our personal and professional lives sometimes. So if something is going to happen, you try and mitigate it not by avoiding it, but reducing that particular risk. And this could be in the case of, for example, if when you look at the likelihood of something which is going to happen and you cannot avoid that, or the time to change that has actually elapsed, then in that case what you look at is you look at the process of reducing that risk. And a simple example of that is, sometimes you see when you have kids in the house, and I'm going to give you a very practical example. If most kids go through the cycle of having chicken pox and things like that, maybe something which they have in their childhood. Now, if one child is to get it in the house, what parents typically tend to do quickly is to quarantine and keep the other one away. So the idea there is to reduce that risk. Now, and to a certain extent also avoid it. But once it happens, what will happen eventually is the other person, if the parents normally don't get it, because you get these kind of things once in life and then your body develops immunity. But in some cases, you try and reduce that from happening to the other child. But in some cases, maybe after a few weeks, rather than reducing, which you have done by quarantine, you still end up having it, or the other child still ends up having that same infection. And that is, even after trying to reduce, you've tried to avoid it, but you still have it. And once they have it, obviously their body develops immunity. So sometimes when you look at this approach of reduction, avoidance, transfer, and acceptance, you have to try different approaches to be able to, look at, having a plan to address that particular risk. Now, that nicely leads us into something which we'll talk about, how do you look at reducing risks, considering that that this is something which is going to happen. Then we look at this approach which is a PwC approach, and a lot of research and frameworks have been put together. This particular thing I've taken across from PwC, which talks about a risk landscape. And if they are to put this in as a consultancy organization and provide this to an organization for implementation, what they tend to do is they will basically say that when you look at risk, there are different types. When you look at the approach of minimizing those risks, and when you continue to work, there's an approach they've developed. And then in order to, once the approach has been adopted, you look at a particular type of response which is required in order for you to, minimize that risk. So this is a bit of a framework, which is a risk landscape framework, which, can be applied depending on the size of the organization and, the size of operations of the organization. And it allows you to, deal with the risks from the point of view of managing those risks that you face and different types of risks that you face within the organization. Now, there is one particular model, which is the Abridged model that we look at. And in this case, this is a theoretical framework. You look at risks which are internal and external. So depending on when you've identified whether they are internal to the organization, that means they are pretty much in your control. You can change, you can adapt, you can implement countermeasures to be able to control that issue, problem which that risk could pose. But if it's external, it could be something which is not something which the organization can handle alone. There has to be a systematic response for that, and that is where it has involvements of different agencies and things like that. So an example of this would be when you look at an Ebola virus outbreak which happened in Congo or in Northwest Africa, what we do see is that it's a risk which it was a risk which was not just posed to a particular country, but a lot of countries. So there was a coordinated effort both from inside and from outside in order to control that outbreak. So when we look at that, what we are looking at is the concept of managing that from a point of view of coordination between a lot of international agencies, the government, and a lot of organizations which work directly or indirectly with the government and international organizations. So a particular framework wherein we've gone through some of the steps, and this is what it actually links up to, wherein it says start with identification, then you do assessment, then you look at some of the strategies that you can put in place in order to look at mitigating that risk. And then once you know that this is going to work, what tends to happen is you create a response or an implementation plan, and that is put into place. And towards the end, you take a bit of feedback and learnings from that so that this can be avoided in the future. Lessons can be learned. This is a very cliched statement that we get to hear from our politicians, but this is something which you also get to hear from people who manage this on a day in, day out basis. And their idea is to essentially look at that if this is something which has happened, should not happen again, and the lessons should be learned. So they are fed back into the system in terms of updating the policies, the procedures to ensure that these situations which arise because of certain say problems or issues, should they arise again, then there is a clear action plan which the organization has to deal with them. Now, apart from that, I think what I've also done is I've classified the risks from an organizational point of view into 3 or 4 types. So one could be risks which are strategic, which are long term, which are related to the organizational goals. One of the things that we do see is that in NHS, they're trying to reduce the waiting times. When we look at the A&E services, the current wait times are in excess of 4 hours. So some of the trusts, some of the hospitals, they are working, they've been given targets to minimize that to, minimum of 2 hours, nothing beyond 2 hours. So when we look at that, they pose strategic risks because it tends to block the whole infrastructure. Because when you call out and you have an emergency, you call them out and you have an ambulance taking you to the hospital. If you do not get a bed, or they are not able to transfer you to a particular bed, or maybe a supervised somebody who is able to supervise, then you're still with the same ambulance within that, and that is where the lead times and the wait times tend to increase. So when we look at strategic risks, we are looking at risks which could be long term, that the organization needs to look at because they're tied to the goals and objectives. And here, what we look at is sometimes the managers, sometimes the management has to look at providing more resources. And these could be in the form of funding. When I say resources, it could be financial, it could be other resources, other types of resources, trained manpower, for example, or maybe, more hospitals, or, different types of things which are related to resources being made available. And in those cases, these risks tend to be strategic. There are operational risks, which means slippages of standard. Even if equipment is there, trained manpower is there, sometimes you will see that, there is still risks which can be posed because the direction of the duties is not done properly, or there is not enough seriousness in the, say, for example, doing their jobs or duties which have been provided in terms of roles and responsibilities. And that could lead to what is called the operational risks. And these could be, for example, the example that I gave you earlier of the, the IT system, which was hacked into. And when we look at that, that's an operational risk, because today NHS has a central and a connected computer system, and if something is to hack into it, something is to happen in terms of a breakdown or an outage, then that poses an operational, because all the patient client data, all the information is primarily fed into the system. And if that is unavailable, then obviously, at some stage when people are, when you look at doctors, nurses, practitioners who are basically wanting the access to the information, if it's not available, then the services come to a bit of a standstill. We've talked about a bit on reputational risk, and this tends to be, even if you look at a normal business, sometimes you buy something and it doesn't work out or doesn't come out to your expectation, you kind of take it into the stride, okay, I'll get a refund. But if you buy something again and you do feel that the product is sub-quality, is not meeting your criteria, you didn't tend to then form an opinion that, okay, I think this brand or this particular product or this particular shop or, an outlet is not worth going into again, because you have kind of made a judgment on the reputation saying that the products or the services that we buy from this particular place are substandard. And when you look at that, sometimes you look at reputational risks. In the long run, when we look at businesses, if businesses do not make profit, if they do not, achieve what is called, the target set by the management or the board. For example, in most cases, when you look at large organizations, if the financial targets are not met, the profitability targets are not met, what we do generally tend to see is that the trust which the board has, or maybe the trust that the senior management has in the chief executive, tends to fade away, and then at some stage, they start looking at a replacement. There is also something which happens is the share price. If the revenue targets are missed, profitability is missed, you will see that shareholders, sometimes the share prices of the company take a beating at the share market, and that is because what they've committed has not been achieved, and that tends to pose a reputational risk, because the company then loses market capitalization value as far as the stock markets are concerned. So in some cases, reputational risks could be related to the organization. It could be to a doctor. If you look at in the surgery, you look at taking a service and you've not been satisfied with the service. If it happens time and again, you lose your faith in it. That's where the reputation starts to slip, and you ask for a replacement, or you ask to be transferred over to a different surgery in this case, for example, and that is because of reputational risk. So that is where I think I will stop, because I think what I wanted to do was start with a bit of fundamentals on understanding what is risk management, how this subject in general can be applied within health and social care, what are the different types of risks, how risks are identified, assessed, what implementation, once the assessment is done, how the implementation of minimizing these risks or the threats which the risk poses can be done. And then towards the end, we look at the different types of risks which are prevalent within a business or an organization, and how sometimes you have to categorize them into different types, and then look at a plan to be able to go and address them. Is that okay?
That's fine. That's lovely. Thank you.
Good stuff. So I've already put the presentation on Moodle.
Lovely.
What I'm going to do is, within a day or two, we'll have the second, third, and the fourth presentation also going up. And I think what I want to do is tailor it to the health and social care sector in particular.
And can you just make sure could you just look through and confirm and find that one that I've asked you to look at, make sure that I've got that in, because I think I'm in the position, I think that this is the only one now that I've got outstanding is risk management.
Yes, I think I've got that detail with me in terms of the unit which you've sent. So all lovely. I want to basically finish that off and send you some formative and summative feedback. I think formative we had already done. So on the basis of that, you had basically looked at correcting some of these things, which was primarily the the inclusion of policies in the annexure, which you've sent me separately on the email. And all I need to do in this case now is to send you a summative sheet, because now I feel what you've done in terms of changes are clearly okay, and they kind of substantiate the achievement of that unit.
Yeah, I think so. So I think and I've already sort of made a start on this, because as I said earlier, I do a lot of risk management every day. So I'm quite confident on this one. It's been quite a good course, because at the end, what I found is that the ones at the end are the ones that I've actually do quite a bit about. So been a bit lucky that way.
That's great. I think on the assignment brief, when we look at, which is on the Moodle, the task 1 and task 2. Task 1 is basically theoretical, so it covers what we've discussed today in a larger effect. That covers most of the learning outcome 1, and also to a certain extent learning outcome 2. The only thing which is pending in discussing learning outcome 2 is primarily to look at the approaches of minimizing risk. So 2 theoretical frameworks that we have to look at in particular is what I'm going to send across in the second presentation, and that is what we'll discuss next week. And the second part of the assignment talks about you picking up a risk, you pick up an area wherein you want to do a full risk assessment, and that is where I think something which will come in handy would be your own policy from the organization of how you look at risk assessment, and maybe take an activity and then follow it in terms of understanding, the 4 parts that we do, which is avoid, reduce, lower, and I think the 4th one, which is to basically, look at taking a low risk in order to, avoid a bigger issue or a bigger concern. So those 4 things have to be looked at from a point of view of, the second part of the assignment. But we'll discuss this in any case. So that's why I put together, I've just downloaded one, and that's where I put the full risk assessment policy, which the NHS employs, but something of a, smaller scale which is available in your organization needs to be looked at.
I'll have a look and see what I can find.
Yeah.
On probably Tuesday, actually, will be when I get around to actually having a look and see if I can find something on our risk assessment policies. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Bye. Have a hot weekend.
You too. Thank you, and bye.
Bye.